One thing that was pretty unique to anime as a medium until the 2010s was that it was one of the only places to find consistent stories containing LGBT+ themes and characters. While cartoons and television series would often contain a side character who is LGBT+, or novels would allude to queerness in their stories, Japanese animation contained quite a few of them, often more explicitly queer than the characters coming from Western media, and sometimes even as main characters. LGBT+ characters and concepts are not new by any stretch to anime and manga, and have traces dating far back in Japanese history. Due to meticulous record-keeping of the Edo period, and it being a relatively recent period of Japanese history considering the age of the country itself, a lot of evidence we have dates back from 1603 until 1868. In the more modern times, influences in the sphere of manga and anime can be seen in the 1900s from writers like Nobuko Yoshida, who is considered to be the first writer in Japan who depicted lesbian experiences. There were also mangakas such as Osamu Tezuka, who was inspired by an all-female acting troupe to create the manga and then anime Princess Knight. The acting troupe that influenced Tezuka, Takarazuka Review, has had a huge influence on the creation of LGBT characters since its founding in 1913. As discussed, culture and social climate often find their way into a work and heavily influence it. I know, shocker of the year. Anime is no different. This can be seen in Yuri on Ice with its influences from the real-world skater Johnny Weir and Russia's strict attitude against the LGBT+ community. Or in The Rose of Versailles, which holds a unique snapshot into the development of feminist shoujo from the Year 24 group and the changing social climate in Japan that the author herself was involved in. When it comes to genderqueer media specifically, there are no series that are able to break away from both the cultural traditions and inspiration of the time period it is from. Social views change through time, and even the words people utilize to talk about complicated subjects, such as sexuality and gender identity, are also influenced by the era they originate from. Add on to that there is rarely a one-to-one translation or agreed upon view from culture to culture, it makes it even harder to analyze a work from one period to another. In the United States, examinations of queer culture in a more academic setting did not begin occurring until the 1970s, and queer theory itself originated in the 1990s. Japan was very similar in its timeline, with entirely different social struggles and syntax to examine LGBT issues. The 2006 anime, Simoun, is not a work that overcomes this common truth of art, but it gave a damn good attempt at being something truly transcendent. Normally, I would place a text disclaimer at the beginning of the video, but I will be covering a large amount of content that deserves a warning. I will be discussing sexual assault, transphobia, homophobia, and general discrimination throughout this video, and due to the nature of Simoun's story, writing a script that does not accidentally come across as transphobic was difficult. Please know that I mean no such phrasing to come across in this way. I am also not Japanese, but an outsider looking in. I have done my best to be culturally sensitive, but as I live in the West, despite my best efforts, many of my observations will come from that lens. For the sake of clarity, as well as keeping a complex topic more simplified, I will be using the words girl-woman and boy-man to refer to gender identity, and male-female to refer to sex. Except when I don't. My discussion of Simoun's story will explain why this will sometimes be difficult to do. Speaking of, in the world of Simoun, everyone across the entire world is born defaultly female. In the country of Simulacrum, there is a mystical spring granted powers by the supposed deity Tempus Spatium. This spring allows people to choose their permanent sex. At 17, everyone is required to go to the spring and choose, to be male or female, making them adults by the standards of Simulacrum. The only exceptions are the pilots of the mysterious ships called Simouns. Until their duty to their goddess and country is served, these pilots do not have to go to the spring. To pilot a Simoun, it takes two girls who must kiss to activate the ship. The ships are capable of giving off a mystical stream that is used to draw designs in the sky. Different designs do different things, from religious and ceremonial rites to combat attacks. It is the pilots of a unit called Core Tempest that the series focuses on as they learn about themselves, one another, their sexual orientations, gender identity and presentation, and even the nature of the goddess Tempus Spatium herself. This is a series whose unanswered questions are important for contextualizing the roles the characters play, but is ultimately about them and how they navigate political movements on an international scale that are out of their control. The series, while not perfect, does take its time to highlight almost every pilot of Core Tempest, though there are a few characters who either receive more screen time than the others, or have stories very relevant to the topics Simoun is trying to explore. In order to streamline this video, as I could literally talk for hours on all of them, I will be focusing heavily on 4 of the pilots bracelets, and have smaller spotlights on individual moments with some of the others that I find noteworthy. I have also done my best to limit spoilers. Simoun is a series that is best experienced without having preconceived expectations of the story, and I will do my best to honor that. The way we talk about the LGBT plus community's relationship with culture and history is defined by words like cisgender, heteronormative, and genderqueer, to name a few. And the symbols commonly used to denote pride developed through Western culture, especially from the legacy of suffering queer people have experienced over time. There was a desire to redefine the symbols of the late 20th century to make something positive out of a past filled with discrimination. Gilbert Baker, the activist who designed the original rainbow pride flag, had many inspirations. In 2015, he stated, "It was necessary to have the rainbow flag because up until that, we had the pink triangle from the Nazis. It was the symbol they would use. We needed something beautiful, something from us. The rainbow is so perfect because it really fits our diversity in terms of race, gender, ages, all of those things." So why bring this up? Well, because the way in which both the common symbols and language many associate with pride developed as a largely Western creation. Even calling it pride is itself another aspect of this. Around the world, there are many symbols and ways in which LGBT rights are addressed, and slowly, the language is mixing. A lot of the words the community in Japan uses are loan words from English or are derivated conceptually. In the 2000s, the word transugenda became used to describe someone who is transgender. Another developed term from the late 1990s is Xandr, which is used to describe someone who doesn't fit into a gender binary. These language differences make it difficult to discuss the identities of characters, especially when it comes to genderqueer content, due to how translation works and how language evolves. Yu Watase, the mangaka behind Fushigi Yugi, is Xandr. Xandr can be the equivalent of non-binary in English, so it does confuse some people that in English, she goes by she/her pronouns. And while in English, many might be inclined to use they/them pronouns, that's not what she uses. Whether it be because of translation or personal preferences is a factor as well. But Xandr doesn't always mean non-binary either and has its own intricate designations. In an article by SPF Dale, there are brief explanations by Japanese people who identify as Xandr on why they identify as such and how their current identity varies from their birth identity. If I had to use Western vernacular to describe the examples given, I would personally use the terms non-binary, genderqueer, and even gender fluid. Basically, this is very complicated. Pride as a concept is universal, celebrating diversity and not being ashamed of intrinsic qualities like sexuality and gender identity, but the form that takes and the language it uses are not universal, and I want to acknowledge that. I will discuss gender heavily in this video and the nature of yuri itself, so I want to give cultural due diligence and acknowledge these complicated differences. While I don't have time for a deep dive and don't feel fully confident speaking on the intricacies of queer issues from a culture that isn't my own, I highly recommend reading An Introduction to Xandr, Examining a New Gender Identity in Japan by SPF Dale, as well as Japan's Queer Cultures by Mark J. McClelland. Their articles were invaluable in how I phrase many sections of this video. Given the description of the series, it is not hard to see how it would lend to a lot of exploration of queer themes. But Simoun is a true lightning in a bottle kind of series purely in how much content it covers and the time period in which it was released. Simoun was released in 2006 and contains themes that are progressive and complex by today's standards. It can be fully argued that every single character in Simoun is queer in some way, from background to main cast, and you can bet that if the character is named, there is an exploration of LGBT plus themes in their story somewhere. Simoun's fandom is small. Due to that, I have found that a majority of the discussions online about it are regarding its yuri content. But what I don't see talked about in depth very often is aspects of the show that focus heavily on gender identity, which is a shame because so much of the series' lore is tied up in it. The presentation in Simoun of a canonical sort of third gender identity is not a new thing in Japan. In fact, roots of it trace back to the Edo period as well, with what many scholars have called a third identity, culturally referred to as a wakashu. Wakashu literally translates to beautiful youths. The wakashu, as described in an article by Priscilla Frank, were seen as androgynous, culturally permitted to present as both male and female, and as the objects of desire for both men and women, donning elaborate hairstyles and long-sleeved kimono robes, known as fiercides. Yet a shaved triangular patch toward the top of the head is the defining mark that identifies the alluring youth as wakashu. A sword peeking out of a samurai sash can also disclose their biological sex, as can their genitals, which occasionally appear in some of the more erotic prints. In Simoun, everyone is born female by default, literally, and in the country of Simulacrum, they are not considered men or women and are distinctly referred to as girls much of the time. Each character uses pronouns that suit their personal feelings or their individual arcs, and those pronouns change as they develop as people. They are not considered adults until they go to the spring to choose their gender. Socially, they are treated as both girls, female, and neither of those things simultaneously. It is not outright stated, but the relationships between them, and especially relationships between the pilots, are discouraged and not taken seriously. Similarly, the Wakashu were born male. Females in this period were not permitted to be Wakashu or don the outfits marking a Wakashu as a Wakashu. So they were considered to be both a third gender and male simultaneously. They dressed effeminately and often had sexual relations with both men and women. But Wakashu were not permitted to have relationships with one another. A Wakashu was not considered to be a man until they went through a ceremony called Genpuku, and then they were expected to be in only heterosexual dynamics moving forward. According to Christian Bach, a scholar with a specialty on East Asian culture, wrote on the intricate customs of the Wakashu. Practically every Japanese male went through a Wakashu stage, which ended with a coming-of-age ceremony called Genpuku. In Simoun, everyone is born female. That I've covered at length. But everyone in the country of Simulacrum is required by both religious tradition and governmental law to go to the spring at the age of 17. Only the pilots, priestesses of Tempus Spatium, are allowed to delay that decision. The similarity between the Wakashu and the birth state of the entire cast of Simoun cannot be overlooked when it comes to discussions of how the series handles gender identity. But it is far from the only aspect of this series that handles gender identity. In fact, this is where the show begins its intense focus on it. The beginning of the series establishes how important the choice of sex is both culturally and to each character. There's a character named Ellie who wants to go to the spring, partially because they do not want to fight in a war. They express how they don't know what to choose and are reminded by another character that the Guardian of the Spring can choose for them. As they walk through the water, they seem terrified, uncomfortable. Ellie is told they will be male and must change their name to Elif. Once out of the spring and in the outdoor air, he falls to his knees and screams as he describes the changes his body will go through to become male. There is no way to undo this. What's done is done, and Elif has to go into the world and make peace with the sex he now is. The character with Elif sees this pain. While already on the fence, she decides to not choose a permanent sex just yet, and returns to the ship with the remainder of her core. I will be referring to this character as she for the duration of the video for pronoun reasons, but also story reasons. While the story focuses primarily on the country of Simulacrum and Core Tempest, it does at times showcase the neighboring countries and how they struggle in this world. Episode 4 covers a very heartbreaking and sobering instance of what happens in a country where even a forced choice is not granted. A man from the neighboring country, the Plumbum Highlands, succeeds in taking 2 of the pilots hostage. He is injured and desperately tries to steal a Simoun so he can return its unknown technology to his own country. He laments to the girls, though they cannot understand him. He asks Iroh and Limine what it is like to live in a country where they can choose their sex. He explains that in his country, the population is kept to a 50-50 split, and the decision is made at birth and enforced via surgery and pills by doctors. His voice is pained, seemingly with bitterness and regret. In his loyalty to his country, he continues trying to start the Simoun's engine despite coughing up a large amount of blood. It lands in his lap and between his legs, evoking the imagery of a menstruation cycle. He inevitably bleeds to death in that aircraft, fails to bring back the Simoun, will never see his loved ones again, and is unable to explore his own identity any further. It is a heartbreaking look at what forced gender roles and body modification outside of someone's control can do. There is no answer to his pain. The show doesn't try to spin it in a positive light. It's the reality he faces, and by scenario alone asks the audience, is it better to be forced to make a choice than to have no choice at all? And that very question is something that becomes a huge part of Iru's story as the show continues. Iroh is one of the main 2 characters of the series and is introduced as a no-nonsense dreamer who forges ahead towards what they want, tradition be damned in their wake. Every pilot has their own reasons for flying a Simoun. In Iroh's case, it's because they don't want to be forced to make a choice. In episode 5, they so brilliantly state, "I'm here because I chose to not make choices." Iroh has witnessed what happens to people who make choices. As the series unfolds, there are times when Iroh is faced with the requirements to make a choice and it throws them off. Iroh develops feelings for Neviril and does not know how to handle the choice of who to place their innermost thoughts in. They are normally confident, always chasing the clouds to the endless horizon. Their introduction was winning a dogfight with pilots from the Plumbum Highlands in a Simoun training craft that had no formal combat capabilities. Later, this is the same person who looks to Neviril for reassurance to sort their feelings when the series hits its climax. Neviril and Iru are the central characters of the series. Neviril is traditionally feminine and the leader of Core Tempest. At the beginning of the series, it shows a battle that she and her then co-pilot Emuria make a final stand in. It is this battle that Emuria goes missing and Neviril suffers from PTSD. Neviril very explicitly harbored feelings for Emuria, and the loss of the one she loved becomes the turning point of her character. Neviril and Iru both have arcs centering on self-expression and personal choice. This is most often presented in the sky. The sky in Simoun was a highlight of the production staff. In an interview from the website and a separate interview on the DVD bonus features, they discuss how they wanted to capture the freedom of the sky, the Simouns being a gateway for the characters to reach it, like birds. Neviril struggles internally at the loss of someone she loved, fearing to even pilot a Simoun again. She feels broken, as if her purpose has been lost. Neviril is simultaneously afraid of the vastness of the sky, the Simouns, and the world outside of the small oasis that is her fragile life as a Simoun pilot. For Neviril, the choice of sex is more than a permanent change of biology. It is the freedom to fly freely as a bird, something she and Iru have in common. In fact, early on, Neviril finds motivation again. Her desire is to pilot a Simoun. She opens the cockpit before a fight and shouts to the others that she is back. Neviril relaxes here, staring into the endless sky across the ocean. For Neviril, flying is the reason she continues. To be grounded is to lose her identity itself, and in choosing a permanent sex, Neviril would forfeit the freedom of choice. In that, Neviril and Iru are very similar. But those two are not where these examinations of gender and sex stop. The character of Waporif is fascinating. He is a mechanic that was a former Sibula before choosing to become a male at the spring. At the beginning of the series, he has breasts and the body of a developed female. As the series continues, his breasts reduce and curves change. By the end, he looks like a man with long hair. The spring changes someone's body at a fundamental level, but it takes time. But once he chose to become male, despite his appearance not initially changing, he was accepted by society as a man and not questioned. There can be a lot to unpack here in terms of the implication of transition being important above all else. After all, once a sex is chosen, a person is guaranteed to become that sex outwardly in time. Humorously, producer Keiji Matsuda compared Waporif to the J-pop group SMAP, and while I'm not going to follow this rabbit trail too far, there actually is some discussion to be had about the performance art of male J-pop singers and how their stage presence can deconstruct concepts of masculinity and femininity. But while Waporif chose to be male, he only discusses one time why he wanted to be one, and it was so he could continue to work around Simouns. Being transgender is a complicated journey for everyone, and no one experience looks identical to another. But if a social role is determined by sex only, and reluctance or unhappiness with one sex, like in Alif's case, mean nothing for presentation, what then does gender and sex even mean in the world of Simoun? While I can't and won't give an answer to a question whose very nature is meant to be interpretive, I do want to look at the production of the anime itself as well as the PS2 game that was made. Yes, this anime got a spin-off game. That is canon, from as far as I can tell. I can't verify because a way to play this is all but impossible to get a hold of in the United States, but I saw the opening and Limine looks so different here and I want to know what it means. Like, did the Sibula... Sorry, got a little carried away there. For most of the mainline interviews of both the game and anime, the staff and cast were asked about their own gender. In the bonus features of the DVD release, the main voice actresses were asked if they would choose to become a man or a woman if given the choice. All of them but one stated that they would become a woman, matching their birth sex. Rika Moringa, the voice actress for Mamina, stated that she would become a man. She said that she wanted to become a man to see what it's like, and then joked with the other women present that it would be so she could hit on women and flirt with them. There were also 6 interviews done with the staff who developed and marketed the PS2 game. Among them, one person also gave a unique answer. This woman, who identified herself as Asha, worked in the public relations department of the company that assisted with Simoun's development. Asha was asked what her gender was, and she responded, "I'm a woman, probably. I've been feeling a lot more like an old man lately. I wonder if I should get some hormone injections." While I won't speak to the identity of this woman, I do find that the candor of both her attitude in the interview and the way she phrased her answer shows that the behind the scenes of Simoun was a very positive one. Some of the actresses, who are decades junior to the director Junji Nishimura, called him Junjun as a nickname, and even joked that he was the most girlish one of the staff. Maria Okada even joked about assigning Nishimura to a core unit as an adult man, since he fit in so well with the girls. While I certainly wasn't there and can't know for certain, the supportive and open environment that seems to have happened during Simoun's production genuinely made me smile. This appeared even on the recording side. Every character in the show is voiced by a female voice actress, even the adult male characters. The actresses actually got to choose who they gave a voice to, and they had fun adapting their voice work to sound more like a man. One of them even stated that no one should hear a girl's voice come from a man, so she worked really hard to sound deeper and more androgynous. As I said, I find it so fascinating how much of the behind-the-scenes production took gender identity into consideration. Again, I have to emphasize that Simoun came out in 2006. The late 90s into the early 2000s were when discussions of gender identity variances were discussed more widely in queer circles in Japan. Much like other queer cultures around the world, LGBT+ support groups were grassroots organizations. Vernacular and awareness were shared peer-to-peer in independently published magazines and pamphlets. The vernacular and rights of trans identities specifically were wrapped in the publications that helped make the modern ideas of yuri and yaoi what it is today. Heck, one of the first mainline celebrities in Japan to identify publicly as LGBT+ is a transgender woman named Ai Haruna. She debuted in 1995 and has spent her life advocating for trans people through her music and modeling career. All this is to say, in the early to mid-2000s, there was not a huge amount of widely publicized conversations about gender identity in Japan, and yet, the production of the series was still filled with quite a bit of consideration for these themes. I could literally talk all day about the ways this series subverts gender expectations, especially the final episode after many of the characters have made their choice at the spring. But this video is already long enough as is, and besides, I don't want to just summarize everything, then there'd be no reason for someone to go watch the show on their own. One trope I see often in anime is the concept of gender ambiguity as a punishment or curse. It could be something like the joke the angel Tink plays in the 1967 series Princess Knight, giving Sapphire a half blue and pink heart. This leads to the gender-bending nature of her character, allowing her to have characteristics of both a boy and a girl. There is 1987's Ranma 1/2, where Ranma is cursed to switch between male and female after falling into a spring. Or in Rig Veda, the 1989 manga series by Clamp, Ashura is cursed to be genderless due to having a spirit of violence. Even in newer works, such as Kakegurui, Rei was punished to lose her very identity and became androgynous as a result. This is not a new phenomenon in Japanese storytelling and is far older than the medium of anime itself. Take Korikabaya Monogatari, for instance. It is a story from the 12th century, the Heian period to be specific. It was written by an unknown author. It is the tale of two siblings who live lives opposite of their birth sex. They each feel within themselves an affinity for both presenting as and taking on the roles of the other sex. This is taken to such seriousness that they even go through the coming-of-age ceremonies for their chosen identity, and not what they were born as. Their father laments such events, but the two siblings are happy taking on the identity that suits them. As the story unfolds, it is revealed that due to actions in their past lives, a Tengu cursed the siblings. And in retribution, a goblin changed the boy into a girl, the girl into a boy, and caused you no end of sorrow. The curse is later lifted by amends being made with the Tengu, and the two siblings live out the remainder of their lives, with their birth sex and societal gender roles now in alignment. A very long time has passed for the goblin, and as a result of your having entered on the path of the Buddha and having had many prayers said as the years have gone by, the situation has been completely remedied. The man will be a man and the woman a woman, and they will be made to prosper as you wish them to. The mental anguish you suffer is but a small part of the retribution from former lives. In this story's case, the deviancy from what was normal was something to be fixed. While genderbender stories are an easy shorthand for the narrative of something's not right and needs to be fixed, the prevalence of these stories and the number of endings where the character embraces their true identity after punishment has been served is not new. Something I want to point out about Torikabaya Monogatari is how distinct it is from stories that explore gender roles. It is a story deliberately about gender identity, even if such phrasings and words were not used in its original narrative. Take The Lady Who Loved Insects, for example. It was published in the same period of time as Torikabaya Monogatari. It is about a woman of the court who ignores social customs and instead researches insects and flowers, refuses to blacken her teeth, and studies Chinese literature. Her interests are, for the 12th century Heian period, considered to be masculine. As Flogfelter so aptly put it, while these attributes are distinctly masculine according to the standards of the time and social milieu, they do not eclipse the character's feminine gender identity, but instead are made humorously by contrast with it. So it cannot be said that Torikabaya Monogatari is nothing more than a sex-based comedy, but is instead a sex-based comedy that deliberately explored some early concepts of gender identity and sex. And as such, it cannot be argued that there is no precedent for anime to explore similar concepts. Despite what some people I've spoken to in the past about anime have said, LGBT+ themes and characters are not included just because of Western influence. These stories and concepts have existed for as long as people have. But you may be wondering, what exactly does this have to do with Simoun specifically? Well, this all comes full circle with the characters Yoon and Onazia. These are characters I will spoil the majority of their character arc of, as well as the story's crucial derivative lore that develops from their endings specifically. If you don't want to be spoiled, skip to the timestamp and return once you've completed Simoun. Everybody gone? You back? Okay. Yoon is a character who appears a little later into the series. They are more mature than most of the other Sibula and portray more devotion to the religious side of piloting the Simoun. Curiously, Yoon is one of the more feminine characters in the series, but often uses masculine pronouns to refer to himself. Yoon is intrigued by Onazia, a religious figure who has been alive for hundreds of years. Onazia is said to enact the will of Tempus Patium and is the figure who facilitates the choice of sex in the shrine. It is discovered at the end of the series that Onazia used to be a Sibula. Onazia deliberately refused to choose to be male or female and was punished for their refusal by being forced to watch over the spring. They are rarely permitted to leave and must stand as a sort of sentinel, assisting others in their choice and being forced to watch them leave for a life outside of the spring. Every person currently alive in Simulacrum has made that choice with Onazia by his or her side, and then left Onazia there. Onazia is not able to eat, sleep, or even touch another living being. It is a hellish punishment for them. They lament their current existence extensively. They become close with Yoon, who talks with them about the nature of the Simouns. At the end of the series, Yoon does not choose a permanent sex. Instead, Yoon confesses their love for Onazia, frees them of their punishment, and takes on the role of the guardian of the spring. This is something Yoon wanted. Simoun, in a beautiful display of love, twisted the concept of androgyny as punishment on its head. Becoming a lone keeper of the spring is no punishment for Yoon. It is something desired. Yoon even facilitates the change of sex for their former companions. They have declared their autonomy and choice for their future. They defied the gender binary forced upon everyone in the world of Simoun and discovered another path for identity and self-actualization. Androgyny, in this case, is no punishment at all. The adult world of Simoun is saddening because of how familiar it is. Underhanded politics and self-serving interests run the country. The jobs females are permitted to hold are limited, and their roles are often relegated to caregivers and mothers. Their clothing also becomes gendered, pants and workers' clothes for men, while women wear shawls and skirts. Their opinions are not as respected, and they cannot hold much political power. So while the Sibula are highly respected as clergy and protectors of the country, they are simultaneously considered lesser by men for being female. This comes to a head in episode 17, when the Sibula complete a joint operation with ground soldiers who are all men. Several of the men leer at the girls, catcall, and behave rudely to them because they are girls. One remarks on how weak they are by saying, "Once you remove a woman from a Simoun, she is powerless." Yet they respect the Sibula as religious clergy and vessels of the will of Tempus Patium. They even later regard the Sibula with respect due to their ability to create Rimajans in the sky and engage in combat themselves. The reality of the Sibula is that their current lives are fragile. Several of them are already older than 17 or are quickly approaching it. In this snapshot of their lives, they have a modicum of power and are often the most free while in the sky while piloting alongside one another. But should the war stop and combat Sibula are no longer needed, should they be gravely injured, should the politics of Simulacrum come into play, they will lose that life. They are girls, and the lives girls have are youthful until they must become adults. Then the lives they lead will drastically change. For all the power, respect, and impact on their country, they are at the mercy of things outside of their control. For some, the choice doesn't seem to be much of a choice at all. If they want a career or to take over the family business, there is only one sex that allows them to do that. One Sibula, Marinus, remarks that she will likely become male so that she can continue working with the Simouns as a mechanic, a role left only to men. Vura, a transfer from a dissolved Sibula corps, remarks that all the pilots of their squad chose their sex based on who had to inherit a family business, and the remainder had the spring choose for them. One character that I want to focus on is Paraeta. They are planning to turn into a man for Neviril's sake. It is an understood and accepted reality that Neviril would choose to be a woman, and in order to be together romantically, Paraeta will have to be male. In Simoun, and Simulacrum at least, same-sex relationships are taboo at worst and are not considered as a possibility by the general public at most times. Instead of overt homophobia, it is the absence of the concept itself. Many of the adult men look back on their days of girlhood and reminisce, or even reference the close and sometimes homoerotic nature of their relationships with their fellow pilots. This is very similar to how many attitudes in Japan regarding gayness have been historically, and still some today. The idea that people will grow out of it, that it's part of adolescence. In fact, in the bonus commentary of the Simoun release, one of the voice actresses confessed that she had a crush on a girl at her school. For the promotion of the series, the voice actresses were interviewed and asked various questions. Reiko Takahashi, the voice of Neviril, was asked if she had ever been in love with a woman. In her words, she had feelings for a boyish older student and went on to say it was from a long time ago. Her attitude is blasé about the situation. I do want to be fair and say that she may have been trying to be professional or safeguarding herself from fans who will obsess over the details of her personal life, but the fact remains that she spoke about it as a far gone part of her life. So when it comes to Parayetta, there's not even a conception of a world where they could be with Neviril without choosing to become male. And while adult relationships are not explored in much depth in the series, the few we do see contain the gendered role of the male leading the relationship. So Parayetta, a Sibula treated as a girl, has the inflicted pressure of living up to standards established by tradition and the adults around them. Parayetta is ultimately an examination of toxic masculinity. They feel both possessive and protective over Neviril, a girl who fulfills the traditionally feminine role and is the closest thing the series has to a stereotypical waifu. They have internalized the social pressure of what being a man should be and how they need to act. Parayetta saw Neviril at her darkest moment, and in what they feel is an attempt to protect her, isolate and control what she does with her life, such as telling other pilots who is and is not allowed to co-pilot with her without input from Neviril. There is also an uncomfortable and sobering scene in episode 17 where they assault her, and it is a wake-up call to Parayetta of what the interpretation of that kind of role is, and is a reminder to Neviril of what the role of a girl is. To be male is to have power, to have identity and respect. To be female is to be weak and protected. To be told your identity is a caretaker. So it begs the question again, what is the role of a girl? Well, commentary from the production staff can shed some light on how these characters were developed. In reading through many of the interviews, it feels like the director, Junji Nishimura, really pushed to have input from female staff to create the complex characters of Simoun. On the surface, a lot of the marketing of the series made it seem far more sexual than it is. These characters were not made for titillation alone. The author of the light novel adaptation, Junko Okazaki, actually said she was surprised Simoun was not a sexually gratifying yuri work and was more of a drama. And while Okazaki goes on to say that the story was written by a bunch of old men and they wrote the script for the first half with the idea of, I wonder if girls are like this, or I wish they were like this, she later seems taken aback as she sees the story unfold and watches the layers of development that went into their personalities. This dichotomy very much tracks with the things that the producer, Kiichi Matsuda, said regarding the development of the story and characters. In a post-series interview, he was asked if he could relate to any of the characters. His response was, no, they're girls after all. I don't think men can understand them. I can't become a man who understands women's feelings. If there were only men who understood women's feelings, stories wouldn't even exist. It's the fact that we don't understand that creates these stories. On one hand, this feels frustrating. Historically, before the 1970s, most creators in manga were men, and those men would write manga for young girls with no input from the target demographic they were aiming for. For decades, these girls were expected to relate to characters written without their input. And often, they would read stories without a girl as the leading hero. There weren't narratives catered to them, it was just expected of them to relate to what was available. And while a writer isn't inherently good or bad based on their sex, writing about gendered experiences without input from those who had those experiences made shoujo manga somewhat stagnant. And once a male creator had grown successful enough in shoujo, they often moved to shonen because it was just more lucrative. It was not until the manga revolution of the 1970s with the Year 24 group that began to change. And while yes, the producer of the series made this comment regarding the characters, I have discovered in these interviews that girlhood was a deliberate focus in Simoun, and to get that so accurately portrayed at times, Nishimura relied heavily on input from the staff who had grown up with the experiences of being a girl. Marie Okada was the head scriptwriter for several episodes in the series, and she and Nishimura actually worked to emphasize multiple queer relationships in the show. Throughout the interviews with the staff, there was a lot of input asked of women regarding their take on the story of Simoun, the characters, and how their own experiences compared. While the industry at the time was heavily male-centric, and to this day still has its issues, the development of Simoun was deliberately an open environment to discuss the concept of girlhood freely. So with that added context, the consideration to take input from those who had grown up as girls is such a wonderful and unique choice made for a non-shoujo work, and what I feel made one of Simoun's strongest elements as impactful as it was, that being the depiction of the solidarity of girlhood. Sibila Mamina is from a commoner family. Her properly braided hair has always been a staple of her pride, of how she carries herself to demand respect since no one had demanded it for her. Her hair is a symbol of being a Sibylla. There is even a scene later where an aristocrat's daughter cuts her own hair to show that she doesn't believe herself to be higher in status or worth than Mamina, that they are equals. It is especially powerful then that the same girl helps braid Mamina's hair later. An animator who worked on the scene said she imagined a bride being prepared for her wedding. Later, Mamina, in an act of defiance to protect another pilot, cuts it off, a sign of protest. For centuries, women cutting their hair has been a symbol of taking ownership of their own bodies and a show of solidarity with women being oppressed under patriarchal regimes. While certainly not exclusive to women, this is a near universal declaration of autonomy and solidarity, and Simoun featuring a girl cutting her hair in the way she did is another way in which the series examines the role and future of femininity. In another episode, Core Tempest defies orders blatantly in solidarity with a fallen comrade. While ordered to perform a combat Remajan in front of important political figures, the girls all nod knowingly. They take off into the sky and perform a dandelion Remajan, a Remajan known entirely for being harmless. It is used for funerals for those who died with great honor. In this moment, the girls have such a small window of time to continue their lives of girlhood, and they seized it, using it to stand with another pilot, defying the political workings out of their control and instead making a stand. To be a girl in Simoun is to cherish a brief time of freedom before adult responsibilities. For when those adult responsibilities begin, everyone is forced into gendered boxes, their opportunities limited by their genitalia. To be a girl in Simoun is to be powerful, to have solidarity with one another, to be weak, to be less than, to be respected, to be innocent and sweet, to be a soldier. While the interview with producer Kiichi Matsuda has some regressive takes on femininity and girlhood, one statement he made stood out to me for what thoughts he might have had that went into creating the role of girls in Simoun. You see, I'm an old man, so I think I felt something similar to Nishimura-san in a way. I've worked on a lot of shoujo anime up until now, but this one was different. It was like the girls were real. Men often have a tendency to seek dreams in women. There's a certain longing, like wishing there had been such girls during one's own student days, although how things turn out if you actually dated them is another story. Simoun had a reality that was different from such fantasies. The difficulty for me, being a man, was how to empathize and direct that. Here he displays so poignantly one of the things that makes Simoun so unique. The characters don't fall into the normal tropes of animeisms. Hell, a lot of mainstream anime in this period was filled with cliches and overly bombastic characters. The isekai trend ain't the first one to burn through every story beat known to humankind. Simoun's characters do not follow that. So much work went into making them feel real, breaking down the barriers of character assumptions. Even the producer, admitting some misogynistic views about the role of women in his life, showcases the raw understanding that women and girls are people, and people are complex, unpredictable, and don't fit into boxes. Simoun is a series of dichotomies, and if I tried to draw a conclusion here and state it as fact, I would do a disservice to the complexity of identity and the story itself. So when it comes to what the role of a girl is, I can't determine that. Only she can. To those who have seen it, Simoun is heralded as a yuri series that commits to being yuri, with a happy ending for some of the pairings. This extended to the official marketing as well. In Japan, the illustrator Hayase Hashiba was commissioned to create the art for a one-volume manga version of Simoun. It was to be published in Comic Yuri Hime, a shoujo yuri magazine. Hashiba had already published other yuri works and was a known name in the yuri community in Japan, so having her name attached to the work made sense. The manga came out before the anime and was used to market the upcoming series. Over in the United States, Media Blasters localized the series and sent advance copies of the individual DVD volumes to Erica Friedman to review on her blog, Okazu. Even on the physical release of Simoun, proudly displayed on the back cover is a pink Venus symbol with the phrase, Yuri fan. Reception seemed fairly unanimous as well. There were no large-scale attempts from distributors or fans to argue that it wasn't an LGBT+ work, nor anyone from the studio officially saying their relationships were up to interpretation. Narratively, in order to pilot the Simouns, the girls have to kiss each other before starting the helical motors. Some of the characters end up together at the end, and not all of them are a female-male pairing, so the series is clearly yuri. Except, well, not exactly. Before I explain, I have to warn you, this section was impossible to discuss without revealing some of the ending story for two of the characters. These two are central to the plot, so if you don't want to be spoiled, go watch Simoun and report back. Okay, so spoiler, Iru and Neveru actively chose to not go to the spring, they refused to make a choice, and they end the series as a canonical couple, with I love yous and all. No death or breakup occurs, the two get to be together without hindrance. Like I discussed in the section on gender identity, boiling the characters in Simoun down to a gender binary does a huge disservice to the depth of the narrative, and this couple is a shining example of why this is the case. There are repeated stories throughout Simoun of characters defying a gender binary and being punished for it, or having their life trajectory determined by their post-spring genitalia. There are even some characters who decide to be female, who work to dismantle the patriarchal attitudes of the system from within, one of them subverting the role she is told she can have because she chose to be female. To ignore this core theme is to ignore Simoun's story. Iru and Neveril's relationship is celebrated in many Yuri circles because of how their story ended, and I can't blame them. Until recently, consistent stories of the love between girls having a happy ending were rare. Added to this was how much Neveril and Iru give nods to Yuri tropes. Often, there's a cool girl with a motorcycle, in this case is Simoun, who doesn't know how to handle the vulnerability of strong emotions, and another girl who feels deeply, is characteristically feminine in dress and manners with long flowing hair. They often balance one another out and improve themselves through their interactions together. This is a comment I found regarding Simoun's finale on a Yuri blog. I have to make clear, this era of online discourse especially was toxic towards the concept of LGBT+ themes. Unless there was a clear-cut statement from the characters or author, people would argue that the characters were not gay. According to Erica Friedman, author of By Your Side, in the 90s there were even people who claimed Sailor Uranus and Neptune were not a couple, and these were people who had access to the original translations and not just the censored English dub. And these talks did not cease until the author of Sailor Moon called Uranus and Neptune partners. So while I do disagree with this comment, I understand, especially with how they word their first sentence, that this comes from a place of defense against the erasure of the time. Queer themes had to be fought for in discourse, and I understand that fully. It still happens today. I personally once saw someone asking if the infamous coming out scene in I'm in Love with the Villainess really used the word gay in Japanese, or if it was just an addition by English localizers. But as the understanding of genderqueer concepts have evolved, I find this take to miss so much of the richness behind Simoun and as a form of accidental erasure. I will at least speak for some of the things I have heard in and about the genderqueer community that I have personally experienced as well. In terms of being AFAB non-binary, there is a level of erasure that happens in queer spaces where someone who is AFAB is told they are welcome in a space meant for women. Unfortunately, so often those phrasings are veiled with the concept of someone still being female, so of course they are welcome. Another insidious element is that someone who is non-binary is not considered to be so unless they meet a certain criteria, that often being androgyny. Someone does not have to be androgynous to be genderqueer. This attitude seems similar to some transmedicalist ideologies that a person is only transgender if they are able to transition surgically. So the take that because they physically look like girls and are voiced by women makes it Yuri ignores so much of the original series. Now, this comment was made 17 years ago. The understanding of gender and trans identity has come a long way from its niche into the public discourse. But I do want to discuss the themes of Yuri and Yaoi in the series from the perspective of the production team. There were a series of interviews with various staff after the series finished airing. One such interview is with producer Keiichi Matsuda, episode director Shigeru Ueda, episode director Song Seung-hee, and the production team member Ai Matsuki. As their final installment on the series, they discuss the themes of gender in Simoun. In the interview, Ai Matsuki points out a couple at the end that ended up being boys' love. Producer Keiichi Matsuda responds with the following. Borrowing Nishida-san's explanation, fundamentally, things like Yuri or Yaoi don't apply to Simoun. Why? Because there's no choice of gender, and since there are only women from birth, Yuri doesn't exist. Yuri exists only when there are both men and women, so in the world of Simoun, Yuri doesn't exist. We call it Yuri for convenience, but originally it's not Yuri. What we are creating is a drama of youth in a society with only women. It's like depicting the Shinsengumi or the Byakutai in Simoun. While Shinsengumi or Byakutai could become boys' love, Simoun can't. First off, for historical context, Shinsengumi and Byakutai were samurai groups that have evidence of engaging in homosexual acts called nanshaku. But the rest of his statement brings up an interesting point. In Simoun, everyone is defaultly female, and there is an argument to be made that because gender and sex in Simoun function on a fundamentally different level than ours, Yuri and Yaoi can't exist, or don't exist in the form we think of. Only in Simulacrum is it known that people can choose their sex. In other countries, sex is chosen at random at birth and fulfilled via surgery. I personally agree that such categorizations as we know them do not fit the world of Simoun entirely, and the labels don't fit those who haven't gone to choose their permanent sex. But I want to also contextualize these statements. There's going to be a snippet of the interview read, and as a note, Nishimura is the series director.
Also, among the female members, the relationship between Gurikif and Anabituf was always a point of interest. I told Nishimura-san it turned into a boys' love after all, but he said, I never intended to make a boys' love story.
Neither did I.
But from a woman's perspective, it sometimes seems that way.
So it seems that way, right?
Yeah,
This quote won't be reread, but this is where the statement about yuri and yaoi is.
That's just being pretentious.
But the pairing of Guragif and Anubitooth is neither boys' love nor gay.
I read the behind-the-scenes settings and the concept art and thought about it, but when asked by the animators if we should hint at it, I wasn't sure what to do. At that time, I told them, please ignore it.
Generally, I think Nishimura-san and Okada-san are a bit off. Guragif in your room, what does your room mean? There are offices in other places. Why your room?
Isn't that what stirs a girl's heart?
I can't accept it.
Why? Isn't it impactful?
It is impactful.
As a job, it's impactful. Why did you guys come up with that line?
But that kissing caused a stir, and the fact that it did means those two had a big impact.
Ah, that's true.
It seems that the female members were also watching those two. The subtlety was nice, and the quiet atmosphere from earlier episodes was good too.
This interview sheds a lot of light on the development of Simoun and some of the conflicting views from the production staff. Kiichi Matsuda throughout this section repeatedly tries to deflect and say that the series did not contain any yuri or yaoi or girls love and boys love. He is even incredulous that a line existed where an adult male asks another adult male to meet him in his room. For context, they do indeed kiss. Even in the world of Simoun, these are two people who chose to become male and fell in love. The nuance to why Neveril and Iru are not exactly girls does not apply here. These two are men, chose to be men, and are in love. The conclusion is obvious that he does not accept that there could be gay relationships in Simoun, even going against Simoun's own established lore. I must note that it was scriptwriter Marie Okada and director Junji Nishimura who pushed for that line to be said. Throughout the series, there was tension with the two male characters in question. Marie Okada wrote the script for many of these scenes. I know I can't assume a lot from secondhand information like this, but everything I've learned about both of them, specifically in my research of this series, has led me to the conclusion that they're allies. Both of them push to emphasize and develop the queer content in Simoun, not just the gay relationship I'm discussing here. In fact, in the DVD commentary, Nishimura joked that the entire reason he created Simoun was so that Armuria and Neveril could kiss while surrounded by enemy forces. He said that a colleague told him, "There's better things to be doing," in reference to the characters kissing while being in a crosshairs, and he did it anyway. Legend. Nishimura also directed nearly half of Ranma 1/2, which has a lot of gender-examining filler that was not in the original manga. So thanks for helping bring more genderqueer stories to the animation scene. Seriously. Like, I know you cannot necessarily extrapolate someone's views from the work they create, but Nishimura has repeatedly given his views in the interviews on the matter. He even addressed in the DVD features that he did continue to put Neveril and Iru into a gender binary, seeing Neveril as a girl and Iru as a boy, and how he had to remind himself that this is not how relationships work in the world of Simoun. The self-acknowledgement of one's own bias is really interesting to me, especially in regards to discussion of gender identity, in the year 2006. Okay, but is this Yuri? Now, earlier I stated that I disagreed with a commenter who said Simoun's pairing of Iru and Neveril was Yuri because of their gender presentation, and I do stand by that. But the question remains, is Simoun Yuri? Is Iru and Neveril's relationship Yuri for a different reason? Actually, what even is Yuri? As Erica Friedman so eloquently asks in her book, By Your Side, is Yuri the schoolgirl romance created by men for a male audience who considers love between girls pure, or is it the girls' romance that has its roots in S literature for a female audience who fondly remember their days admiring upperclassmen at all-girls schools? Or is it for lesbians, whose stories are nominally acknowledged in stories of self-awareness, of love for a member of the same sex or feelings of being different, without any use of the word lesbian? The heterogeneity of creator and audience causes difficulty in both definition and scholarship. Who gets to define Yuri? Now, the origins of the Yuri genre begin with Nobuko Yoshia's 1916 serialization Hana Monogatari, which explored the intimate, romantic dynamics between girls. She went on to publish many other works that became the basis for many of the story beats in shoujo and staples of Yuri manga and anime, such as the emphasis on musical instruments and the imagery of flowers. She was the beginning of the 20th century movement of literature called S literature. S stood for things like sex, shoujo, and even sappho. There were stories of relationships between girls, some romantic, some platonic. It was a feminist movement that sought to personify the dynamics of girls and show individualized identities of these girls and women separate from men. Often these stories had an older to younger dynamic, such as an older student mentoring her junior. Much like the testimony from Neveril's voice actress regarding her own school days crush, the stories often depicted short flings for the girls before growing up. Growing up could mean graduation from school, a heterosexual marriage, or even death of one or both parties. Part of this was due to a common cultural belief that same-sex love was a natural stage of development someone would go through, in this case girls, being a natural progression to a heterosexual marriage and motherhood. Class S built the foundations of yuri and girls' love as well as shoujo, which is all the sadder that in 1937, censorship by the government made the movement die out almost entirely. It was in the 1970s when a group of female mangakas called the Year 24 group revolutionized shoujo. Many of these authors drew inspirations from S literature and gave rise to such works as Couple of the White Room, The Rose of Versailles, and Claudine. The yuri of this era can be described as messy, tragic, and melodramatic. It is so interesting, then, that Simoun takes place in a country where women are restricted and each of the characters are fighting for their own sense of choice and freedom, and that the ultimate defiance of tradition is for Iru and Neviril to steal a Simoun and fly away together into an endless horizon in the sky, both declaring love to one another and deliberately choosing not to make a choice of sex. And in Simoun, if the role of a girl is to be someone who hasn't chosen sex and still yet a girl simultaneously, then that leaves some of Simoun's pairings in an unusual place. And then there is sapphism. According to Wikipedia, sapphic is defined as an umbrella term for any woman attracted to women or in a relationship with another woman, regardless of their sexual orientations and encompassing the romantic love between women. The term is inclusive of individuals who are lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, aromantic, asexual, or queer. There are also sapphic people who are non-binary or genderqueer. As the understanding of sexuality and gender identity has evolved, so has language. Words like sapphic have adopted their own changing definitions, as is so well documented by Adriana Sisko in her dive into the evolution of queer terms on Tumblr, of which I don't have time to get into, but I will link her article in the description. Even the term Xandr, which is used in Japan to describe someone who does not fit a gender binary, has a lot of nuance. In 2000, a short documentary titled I Don't Know How I Can Read That Verbally, also known as a title made up of common symbols for sex, was released and contained interviews and snapshots into the lives of different queer people. One such person, Morita Shinichi, described themselves as someone who presents feminine and might be seen as a transgender male to female, but they do not identify as female and merely present that way due to being gay. A showcase of how complex identity is even across culture. This is a culture where the words used in the United States are not widely used, if they're used at all, but the experience of how complicated it is still very much universal. With all this in mind, it must be asked, does sapphic automatically equate to yuri? It cannot be denied that Iru and Neviril, as well as the other girls, present feminine by our current social standards, and as I discussed earlier, are treated as girls and female by the cast, despite a distinctive difference of sex being a core of the narrative. Before going to the spring, the cast of Simoun can most definitely be called sapphic. Sex educator Tia Freeman explained in a 2022 interview with Them, a queer-centric news outlet, sapphic is gender expansive. It strips away rigid control of how someone is supposed to present and at its root embraces love. But does that make this yuri? Erica Friedman writes on the current definition of yuri as used by Yuricon. Yuri can describe any anime or manga series or other derivative media, fanfiction, film, etc. that shows intense emotional connection, romantic love, or physical desire between women. Yuri is not a genre defined by gender or age of the audience, but by the perception of the audience. So this whole section is to say yes, no, and it depends, which isn't the most satisfying answer, but hardly will you find an examination of literature that is. Religion and the LGBT+ community is a touchy subject at the best of times. Historically and today, LGBT people have experienced harsh discrimination for merely existing. This is even referenced in Yuri on Ice when Yuri Katsuki remarks about the pressure of performing in a place like Russia, the implication being because he's gay. Which makes it so interesting that gender, sex, and sexuality are intertwined with a matriarchal religion within a patriarchal society. The goddess in Simoun is called Tempest Spatium, and she is said to be the one who left the mythical Simouns for the Sibylla to pilot. I haven't talked much about the Simouns. They are ships that have motors called helical motors, lovingly rendered in 2006 CG animation. No one knows how the helical motors which power the ships function. The mechanics only work on the structures attached to the motors. They are alluded to be a breakthrough of science and miracles, a perpetual motion machine. The fact that Simulacrum has them leads people to believe they are blessed by the goddess, and furthermore, only those who haven't chosen their sex can pilot them. There is a reverence to Tempest Spatium, even from the male soldiers that sexually harass and catcall the main cast. They bear the symbol of Tempest Spatium, and many of them pray to her, and she is a her. The highest leaders of the religious clergy are all women, the only position of significant power available to someone who chose to become a female at the spring. At least the only one shown in the series. Of the pilots, they all have varying levels of reverence to the goddess. Iru doesn't care at all for the religious side of things and even says they are happy to be a pilot because they can fight. Later, Iru does see the comfort religion brings people. With war looming on the doorsteps of the common people, they look to Iru for comfort, and they pray over them and try to assuage their fears. Neviril has to assure Iru in turn that they are a priestess even if they don't believe themselves to be. Episode 9 gives a dramatic show of just how integral religion is to the people of Simulacrum. Onazia, the guardian of the spring, is called to a council meeting. Some of the most influential figures in the country are there. Neviril is testifying in the case, regarding the role of Core Tempest and the other pilots as soldiers and not just priestesses. Neviril is scolded for speaking out of turn and over the men in the room. Onazia speaks up and everyone shuts up. They hold on to every word Onazia says. It is Onazia who ultimately has say over what happens to the core. Neviril brings up that as a priestess, she is being forced to engage in combat, going so far as to call it slaughter. She demands to know if she is a soldier in war or a Sibula. The religious leaders call it blasphemy to question the directives given, while the military powers look on Neviril as a naive soldier. Both groups are ignoring the personal agency of the pilots. And Onazia so brilliantly tells Neviril that she is whatever she wants to be, but being a soldier and priestess are not exclusive. Bloodshed is happening in the name of God, and ignoring that is to ignore reality. The choice to be male or female at the spring is the end of the service of a Sibula. At one point, Sibula only participated in funeral and religious rites. With a war tearing the country apart, they have been forced to be soldiers or go to the spring. The show does ask if the role of a Sibula evolves or if it should stay as it always has. Most of the pilots are not just there due to religious piety, but necessity. In fact, the most devout went to the spring because they refused to fight. Later, it is revealed that a neighboring country they're at war with, the Plumbum Highlands, also worship a goddess. Scholars from the Plumbum Highlands claim their goddess and Tempest Spatium are one and the same. The series goes to great lengths to explore the question, what is their relationship with God? And what is the role that God and religion plays in the world the characters live in? When not piloting, the Sibula park their Simouns on a large floating ship called the Arcus Prima. It is a ship designed specifically for Sibula cores to train on and use as their home base. It is a warship. On it, there is a cathedral to Tempest Spatium. At the front, there is a large statue bearing her emblem. Throughout the narrative, the characters come here to talk about their worries with one another, pray, and even cry. Later in the series, a character makes a decision to go against the laws of the church. The statue of the goddess is knocked to the ground. This statue, that used to loom over some characters, or even tower as a comforting figure, is smashed to pieces. And it is very telling that laid bare on the ground, it really was such a small thing after all. Episode 11 shows this struggle from outside the Sibula. I mentioned it earlier, but there is a joint operation between the Sibula pilots and ground soldiers. One of the Sibula, Floe, speaks with a soldier, and he opens up about his reverence for the positions of the Sibula and Tempest Spatium. He speaks about how he wants to reclaim the city they're attacking because it was his home growing up. During the operation, in order to not have mass casualties of soldiers, the Sibula bomb the city with Remajans and destroy it. The statue shatters and the city is engulfed in flames and death. The soldier who showed such faith before shakes, afraid of the devastation unfolding before him. In anguish and through gritted teeth, he states, "The Simouns are demons." Across the world, belief in religious practices have often come in conflict with LGBT+ rights. In the United States, there have been many hate campaigns over the years targeting those who identify as LGBT, and as of late, especially the transgender and genderqueer communities. Religious belief often finds its ways into politics to harm those who are LGBT. Which letter is focused on has changed depending on the year, but in 2023, a Republican in the Florida House of Representatives made some choice comments about transgender people. He stated, "We have people that live among us today on planet Earth that are happy to display themselves as if they were mutants from another planet. This is the planet Earth where God created men male and women female. I'm a proud Christian conservative Republican." He went on to further call trans people demons and imps who come and parade before us and pretend that you are part of this world. In Topeka, Kansas, two houses sit on a quiet street. One is painted in rainbows, the other the transgender pride flag. Across the street, an anti-LGBT church bears signs with slurs of hate against the community. While this is only a snapshot of the United States, these same incidents have played out across the world. And though it is certainly not only religious practices that have discriminated against the community, it is impossible to say that religion has not played a factor. In Japan, there has not been the same history of bigotry and prejudice. In fact, sodomy was only made illegal in Japan for a few short years, beginning in 1872, and this occurred because of increasing Western ideals coming into the country. Before Japan moved from an isolationist country towards the end of the Edo period, bisexual exploration before marriage was considered the norm, and it was not locked by sex. Males and females both participated in same-sex relations and relationships. This is so well documented that there are rough numbers of how many brothels were in different regions. While the social culture of Japan in the Edo period still had its issues in regards to attitudes towards same-sex relations, especially the idea that people should settle for a heterosexual marriage, this was still quite progressive compared to the more westernized values that came about at the turn of the century. One Western publication at the time, called Eastern World, stated that the same-sex relationships between Tokyo students was bestial, unnatural, infamous, and unclean practices of the future lawgivers, officials, and teachers of Japan. While I don't have time in this video to examine the slow breakaway from queer acceptance, I want to point out that nearly all moves to criminalize, erase, or discourage LGBT+ rights were not because of religious rhetoric, which makes the writing decision in Simoun to link a loss of freedom and potential destruction of a form of gender expression to religion so powerful. This is a story about the nature of religion, social power, and structure and identity. I could find no specific reasoning why religion was chosen, if it was even thought about at all in regards to exploring the dynamic of queer rights and religious belief, but the fact remains that a series from 2006 examined this in a more mainstream venue than most other stories of its kind and time. I truly wish I could explore this more in the video, but this is getting to major story spoilers, so I really do have to leave it as it stands. But the exploration of religion, its role in society, and the obligation of people to it is so deliberately told that I find it just as integral to the story as the choice of sex. As much as I love analysis and enriching art through history, I also don't like to give inaccurate depictions of things, and Simoun is no exception. Simoun is a series that suffers from a lot of issues in its narrative. As much as I hate to say it, Simoun's middle portion is boring. Some of the topics covered are rather serious, though. The show takes a look at the rigid purity rules put in place for the Sibula. They are not permitted to have sexual relationships with men until they go to the spring and become women. A soldier actually tells Floe that she is getting too close to him and he wants to respect her as a priestess. Floe even says she will become a woman, so it doesn't matter. Later, he is so disgusted with the destruction that Simoun's caused that he presumably doesn't speak with Floe again. I say presumably because after he calls Simoun's demons, the episode ends and this is never mentioned again by anyone in the narrative. Another instance is between the pilots Alti and Kaim. They are sisters with a lot of animosity between them. It is addressed that one of them may have sexually assaulted the other, but who did it is unclear because the narrative suggests that there is a chance the one who did it convinced herself that she did not. It is meant to be intentionally unreliable, and for what purpose, I'm not entirely sure, as this plotline is dropped after the episode it is introduced in and never brought up again. In the cases of sexual assault and coercion, the lack of resolution or consideration to the narrative it is in would be a huge hindrance to the show if its inclusion was noteworthy enough to make an impact beyond being uncomfortable with no further explanation. Which is a shame, because a series that was so thoughtful on things like gender and personal choice could have been a great vehicle to explore the intricate emotions, reactions, and trauma that comes from sexual abuse. And it just didn't. And then there is Dominura. Dominura shows up and makes the plot happen. I know I'm known for being academic and all, but every time she's on screen, you can bet your ass she is slaying and bringing the plot smack down. She's so good at it that the show has to bitch smack her out of the narrative for a while because she dared to make the middle episodes more engaging and would have finished the story prematurely. No, I'm actually not kidding. Not Sailor Pluto fulfills one of the most integral roles of all the characters. Dominura is a character who questions what is going on, has a past wrapped in lore, and moves forward towards an answer. It does make Dominura's character a nice juxtaposition to the others. I said it earlier that those in Simulacrum are not considered to be adults until they go to the spring. Dominura is older than the others and thus has matured and has a different focus on life to the other pilots. It's a very unique examination of how different their world is from our own, because most viewers will probably think of Dominura as an adult right away, but to those in power, Dominura is merely more mature than the others who haven't gone to the spring. These issues, unfortunately, really brought the narrative down in several ways, and while I truly do think Simoun is a wonderful series, I can't in good conscience talk up a series and analyze it without at least pointing out some of its flaws, when those flaws directly affect the themes I so hail the narrative for. I've said it a few times throughout this video, but it is absolutely wild to me that Simoun came out in 2006. While not perfect by any means, the show handles some very complex topics regarding attraction and gender identity in a way that would largely be considered progressive by today's standards. The 1990s were a time of grassroots LGBT+ organizations in Japan coming to the forefront of wider discourse. A man named Minami Teshiro was an editor of a small-time gay magazine called Adon, and this attracted the attention of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association. With their help, the first Tokyo Pride Parade was in 1994. In 2003, the first openly LGBT politician was elected in Japan, Aya Kamikawa, a transgender woman. She became the highlight of a ton of media discourse and brought trans issues specifically into the public zeitgeist, and in 2004 helped push a law forward that would allow, under very strict conditions, transgender people to change their birth sex on official documents and on the official family registry. It was in these early years of understanding of transgender identity that Simoun was released. While leaning heavily on Yuri for marketing, the story contained in Simoun defied many similar stories of its time and became something truly special. In a post-series interview, director Junji Nishimura and scriptwriter Marie Okada sat down to give their thoughts on the creation of Simoun. The interview was a delight to read after completing the series. Okada and Nishimura truly loved working on Simoun and developing it beyond its initial planning stages. It is here that Okada tells Nishimura that his writing felt like that of a girl, and he was the most feminine person on staff. He actually voiced hesitancy writing for a cast of all girls, but found himself getting more and more invested in completing their stories as it went on. His final words to those who watched the series were, "And to all of you who continued to strongly support Simoun even after the broadcast ended and regularly visited this site, you are the helical motors and driving force that supported and promoted this work. We are so grateful that words alone cannot express it, but all we have to say is thank you. Thank you for loving the world of Simoun and watching over the girls." I didn't quite know how to conclude this, but as a non-binary person myself, I found the representation in Simoun and the themes it explores to be so refreshing and honest. While there is no piece of media that can truly be called perfect, and Simoun is no exception, it is a series that deserves a second look, especially in the 2020s, where collective acceptance and understanding of gender identity has grown and become something not hidden, but openly embraced by many.